Let the words of my mouth and the meditation of my heart be acceptable to you, O Lord, my rock and my redeemer. Amen. So Solomon, on the one hand, the height of the Israelite monarchy, on the other hand, the beginning of the downfall. Today, we read one of the foundational stories of Solomon's reign. It keys into the 3 long chapters establishing this new and great king, even though we're just reading Solomon's request for wisdom. David was the great Israelite king, but that doesn't actually mean his reign was the greatest. Because it takes a whole career to build a kingdom from scratch, and that's what David dedicated his life, his career to doing. He had a little bit to work with, but he really built the kingdom from almost nothing. Solomon was the one who got to put that kingdom to work and to refine it. And as I was thinking about this story, it reminded me of the church that I did my field placement in. So technically, they are still in their first building, but it looks nothing like when it was new. I believe it started out as a simple clapboard building about the dimensions and layout of this building. And then they added wings onto either side of the sanctuary, which allowed them to put a balcony in the back. They built an addition onto the front to cover the stairs and provide a narthex area. I think they put an addition on the back as well. So they sort of covered all 4 walls. And then they also, at some point, redid the sanctuary. It was all this really rich red velvet and brass, and like really done to the nines in, I would say, probably turn of the century 1920s style. Really, at that time, no expense was spared. And that's all that's left of the old building is sort of the center part of the roof, if that's even original. And they've got beams and archways sort of cutting the sanctuary into thirds. And that's where the original walls were. The beams and archways are made of the original walls. It's kind of a Theseus's ship kind of scenario. I don't know if you've heard that story, but if you have a ship, Theseus had this ship and he replaced every plank on it over time and every rib, and the question is it still Theseus' ship, right? And this church is kind of like that. It would have been a very impressive church 100 years ago, and a very simple one almost 200 years ago. And to use this church as a metaphor, David would have built the original simple clapboard building, a modest building in a frontier town, but one that was celebrated for coming out of nothing and beginning the adventure. And I'm not sure if this picture that I've got in my head is of that church, but I have this picture, a black and white picture, early of, I think it was this church, with horse and buggies in the background and a dirt road and sort of almost Old West looking buildings to the side, and then this just kind of tired, clapboard looking building. It's sort of a traditional picture. Very modest. It was this modest building in a frontier town, but one that was celebrated for coming out of nothing and beginning the whole adventure. It was an important building despite its simplicity. Solomon would have been the one that added the additions and really made it into what we recognize today. Today, those additions are old. They've been around for generations, and nobody has been around for a few generations that remembers the old church. The old church is the new church, really. The original David church is unrecognizable for generations. Solomon was the one that formed the image we all remember. And I think this is important because the writer of Kings, or writers, it was multiple, they're kind of like us. If you were to go into the church today, it's tired. There's carpet from the 70s that was meant to be in the 1920s style, same as the rest of the church. There's a layer of dust and dings, very darkly stained wood. Everything's faded from the sun. It's got the smell of old building and old books. Kind of a nice smell, but it depends on your tastes. It's still a grand old dame, but it's tired. And frankly, it's beyond the congregation's needs, resources, and even imagination. Kings was written in the exile, when everybody was looking back at the good times and trying to grab onto a piece that they remembered. They celebrated David, but they remembered Solomon's work. And they remembered Solomon's work from the exile. And the thing is, the decline always begins after a peak. What do you do after you win the Stanley Cup, right? Don't ask Edmonton, because they just kept winning. If you want to win a game, it's not actually the same achievement anymore. It's you did it last year, so it's not quite as exciting. And you can't use last year's playbook this year, so eventually something's got to give. All you can do when you've reached the top is decline and work back up again. Start the cycle over again with a new generation of fans, a new generation of players a few years later. And yes, I know that there will be Leafs jokes after this. I know that they always get to the playoffs and never win, and that's probably why. But anyway, we won't go there. The nature of being at the peak is that the only way forward is down. How far up or down, or how far down is up for debate. You know, you kind of want to decline just a little bit and then bump back up. That's kind of the healthiest growth graph. But it's got to go back down before it comes back up. And my goal today isn't actually to talk church. I don't really want to get into church decline or anything like that, but I'm going to run with the metaphor just a little bit longer. Because we know that 1967 was the peak of Christianity in Canada. Never in Christian history did we have that much critical mass or influence. And a good number of you folks, I think everybody today, except Angela, me and Angela, were around in 1967. So today is something like the lowest point in the church since the 4th century. And my question is, did you know in 1968, the year after, that you were on the decline? What about 1978? My suspicion, talking to older clergy, is that the general population didn't really start to realize something was wrong until maybe even into the 90s. It could have just been a dip. The thing is, the seeds for the downfall were sown probably in the 50s, 60s, maybe even earlier. To be frank, I think a fall from such a position was inevitable, and we've been going through a social revolution for a century now. It makes sense to me that we are where we are. It's part of the resurrection cycle that the church really privileges. But I think our fall from grace probably, I could talk about this all day long, but it probably came from a sense of privilege that our position gave us when we were strong. We didn't need to read the Times because we didn't think we had to. Again, I'm painting with a very broad brush today. Kings celebrates Solomon's rule. There's absolutely no question. It even lets him off the hook for taking an Egyptian wife. Something, an egregious sin in those days, not today, but in those days, and something the rest of the Bible does not do. But they're writing 400 years later, looking back from the Babylonian exile. They're celebrating, but they're also looking for lessons from history. They're trying to find out what happened. The story says a lot about Solomon. The whole idea of the creator of life, the universe, and everything saying, I'll grant you one wish, anything in Solomon saying, give me wisdom, is, well, very wise. Asking for wisdom is selfless, it's prudent, it could lead itself to the riches that Solomon did not ask for. It certainly would lead to contentment. But I kind of think Solomon was wise already. Asking for wisdom is a pretty wise thing to do in the first place, so someone who asks for wisdom probably already has it. Secondly, Solomon had just in the previous section thwarted a pretty sly plan for his brother to steal the throne. So this story is traditionally seen more as a test than an offer. God would have known what Solomon would ask for because God knew Solomon. But there's two things to keep in mind about Solomon. First is that he was a womanizer. And not in the way that the Old Testament tends to turn a blind eye towards for kings. Yes, he had a huge harem like every other king in those days did, I gather even bigger. But he also had multiple primary wives from multiple nations. He was big on marrying princesses from around for strategic reasons. Something the Bible certainly looked down upon. Also, the thing about wisdom is that it often leads to compromises. And compromises can get out of hand. When you study Solomon, and his predecessors, or successors as well, but especially Solomon, it's very interesting to ask, is this a positive action biblically or politically? Often the mistakes that Solomon makes are very impressive political moves. You could study Solomon in political science at university today. Pharaohs, this is the example from just today, pharaohs, as a rule, did not marry their daughters to foreign dignitaries. This is Solomon, the descendant of Egyptian slaves just a couple generations before, and he's showing that Israel was more powerful than even Egypt. Egyptian pharaohs often took wives from other nations, but they'd not give their own daughters. And it was a sign that Egypt was stronger than all the other nations around, and Solomon turned that on its head. His reign is littered with moves like this. A serious political move, but Israel seriously looked down upon foreign wives at that time. So a bad biblical move. Hi there. What this passage screams to me today is that things do not have to be going well for God to make use of them. And I want to be really clear. I don't think God causes these things, but I think God uses all things. And in fact, this is an imperfect world. So really, God only has imperfect people to work with. Think about this. And I'm being deliberately controversial here, but think about this. Without fossil fuels, there could be no green movement. And you might think, great, we wouldn't need one, except pre-industrial life in the West was not a good life unless you were a privileged elite. It was the Industrial Revolution that brought us to where we are today. It gave us the opportunity to have the conversations that we needed. And the Green Revolution will teach us how to retain the good things we've learned from the past 200 years while becoming much better stewards of the environment. Another example, a global pandemic is a bad thing, but it's gotten us all to sit still and pay attention to all sorts of injustices. World wars are bad, but it was in the wake of the Second World War where we discovered all kinds of important things about ourselves. I don't think God causes these things, but God uses these things. And so coming to a close, as an exercise, I want to challenge you to do two things this week. First, I'd like you to take some time to forgive someone. And I'm even going to let you off the hook a little bit and say, really just, I'm talking in your heart this week. They can be living or dead. You can actually forgive them, or you can just let go of something that you're holding on to. The goal with this week is to look at that person as a multifaceted individual. Look at them like this pot. Recognize the cracks, but see the beauty elsewhere. What are the positives and negatives that have come from the natural compromises human beings have to make in their lives? The second part of it is to look at yourself. Take a moment to think about a time that you made a mistake, something that you're holding on to. What good came from it? It doesn't mean that it still isn't a mistake, but it also doesn't mean God can't use it. One of my fears, and I've had this conversation with a bunch of people lately, is that we're losing track of nuance. No person or thing can be wholly good or wholly bad. Most of us are just doing the best we can. So I'd like you this week to take a moment to recognize our own imperfections and that of others. And also to recognize that we're all trying to take a step forward. The chorus for the song that I tried to play earlier, but our internet's not working, is there's a crack in everything, and that's how the light gets in. Amen.